A slap cracked through the restaurant, and before anyone could react, the man who did it realized he wasn't the most dangerous person in the room. The old woman didn't scream, didn't fight back, but someone else was already standing up, and by the time the manager understood who had seen everything, it was far too late. If this story pulled you in, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. I've got another unforgettable story dropping tomorrow, and while you're here, jump into the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our community from all around the world. All right, let's get back into it. The sound cut through the chamber music like a gunshot. Smack. Time fractured. Crystal glasses trembled midair. The Vivaldi string quartet playing from hidden speakers seemed to choke on its own melody. Christopher Francois's hand hung suspended in the aftermath, fingers still spread from impact. Marilyn Osborne's head snapped sideways with a force that defied her fragile frame. Her reading glasses launched from her face, spinning through the amber restaurant light before clattering against the marble floor near table 7. The room didn't just go quiet. It collapsed into silence. Christopher stood frozen in his own violence, arms still extended, chest heaving beneath his tailored black vest. His dark hair, meticulously styled with pomade, remained perfect despite the sudden movement. His white dress shirt, rolled to the elbows, revealed forearms tensed with residual anger. He was young, perhaps 32, with the kind of sharp features that suggested ambition had carved away anything soft years ago. Marilyn staggered backward, one weathered hand shooting out to catch the edge of the white linen tablecloth. Her fingers, gnarled from decades of work, her modest appearance couldn't hide, gripped the fabric like a lifeline. The impact had turned her cheek a violent shade of crimson that clashed grotesquely with her pale, papery skin. She wore a tan cardigan over a floral blouse, both clean, but unmistakably old. Her gray hair, pulled back in a simple bun, had come partially loose from the force of the blow. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman in her 70s who had dressed in her Sunday best for an occasion no one else could see. The Rosewood Pavilion restaurant had been designed to make people feel wealthy even if they weren't. Chandeliers cast honeyed light across tables dressed in cream linens and silver place settings. Leather booth seating curved along exposed brick walls. Potted palms stood in corners like silent witnesses. The menu featured words like artisanal and curated. The average entree cost more than Marilyn's monthly electric bill. Right now, all that manufactured elegance felt obscene. At table 3, a woman in a pearl necklace and designer dress sat with her hand pressed to her mouth, eyes wide with shock. Her husband, a heavy-set man in a gray business suit, had gone completely still, his fork suspended halfway to his lips, a piece of seared scallop forgotten. At table 9, a young couple who'd been laughing seconds earlier now stared with expressions that cycled rapidly through disbelief, horror, and the particular paralysis that comes from witnessing something unthinkable. The woman's wineglass tilted dangerously in her loosening grip. Near the window, an elderly gentleman with white hair had half risen from his seat, one hand on the table for support, but he made no move to intervene. His face carried the look of someone whose conscience was fighting his self-preservation. Phones stayed in pockets and purses, not from respect or solidarity, but from the primal understanding that some violations were too raw, too immediate to be filtered through a screen. This wasn't entertainment. This was the kind of moment that lodged in memory like shrapnel. Learn. Some. Manners, Christopher hissed, each word sharp and deliberate. His voice carried across the dining room with the confidence of someone who believed the entire establishment existed to validate his authority. When I explain a charge to you, you accept it. You don't question. You don't argue. You certainly don't waste my time like some... He caught himself, but the unspoken word hung in the air anyway. Marilyn's breathing came shallow and fast. Her left hand trembled against her reddening cheek, feeling the heat of the handprint already forming. Her right hand still clutched the tablecloth, knuckles white with effort, but her lips thin, colorless, trembling remained pressed together in determined silence. She didn't scream. She didn't curse. She didn't threaten to call the police or demand to speak with ownership or invoke any of the Chenley responses a younger, different kind of person might have unleashed. She simply stood there, absorbing the pain, breathing through the humiliation, existing in the awful aftermath with the practiced endurance of someone who had survived worse. Behind Christopher, near the kitchen entrance, 2 waiters stood frozen with trays balanced in their hands. One was barely 20, his face pale beneath his crisp white shirt and black apron. The other, older and more weathered, wore an expression that suggested he'd seen Christopher's temper before but never quite like this. Neither moved to help. At table 12, tucked in the corner where the lighting was deliberately dimmer, where the ambient noise from the kitchen provided natural cover for private conversations, sat a man who hadn't moved since the slap echoed through the room. Jago Silvestri sat perfectly still, his hands resting flat on either side of an untouched plate of ossobuco. He wore a black suit with no tie, the collar of his white shirt open just enough to reveal the dark edge of a tattoo that crawled up his neck. More ink decorated the backs of his hands, geometric patterns and symbols whose meanings weren't meant for strangers to understand. His face was all hard angles and controlled stillness. Dark eyes that absorbed everything and revealed nothing. A jaw that looked carved from something denser than bone. The kind of face that didn't need to show emotion, because its resting state already communicated danger. He'd been watching Christopher Francois for the past 20 minutes. He'd noticed the eye rolling when Marilyn had asked for tap water instead of the bottled selection. He'd heard the condescending tone when she'd requested a few extra minutes with the menu. He'd observed the theatrical sigh when she'd dared to question the $17 service enhancement charge that appeared nowhere on the posted menu. And he'd seen the slap coming 3 seconds before Christopher's hand made contact, had recognized the particular tensing of shoulders, the forward lean, the transformation of irritation into violence. Jago hadn't intervened. He'd simply watched, measured, calculated. Now, as Marilyn bent slowly to retrieve her fallen glasses, Jago's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle forward lean, a fractional adjustment of weight, the physical prelude to a decision already made. Marilyn straightened with visible effort, her glasses clutched in one shaking hand. She didn't look at Christopher, didn't look at the frozen witnesses, didn't acknowledge the horrible theater she'd become the centerpiece of. She looked at nothing and no one as she whispered, barely audible above the resumed string music, "I apologize for the trouble." Then she turned slowly, carefully, like someone navigating around broken glass, and began walking toward the restaurant's entrance. Christopher watched her go with a expression of contempt and satisfaction, already turning back toward the kitchen, already dismissing the incident, already convinced that his authority had been affirmed rather than obliterated. He didn't notice Jago Silvestri stand. He didn't see the cold calculation in eyes that had just witnessed a debt being called. He didn't understand that the next 8 minutes would cost him everything he'd spent a decade building. Behind him, table 12 sat empty. A half-finished meal and a folded black napkin, the only evidence that anyone had been sitting there at all. Marilyn Elizabeth Osborne had learned the language of silence before she learned to tie her shoes. Born in 1954 inches, a Pennsylvania coal town where men came home black with dust and women scrubbed floors until their knuckles bled. She'd understood early that the world didn't reward women who spoke up. It punished them. Quietly, systematically, with a thoroughness that left no visible bruises. Her father had been a foreman at the mine, a man whose authority underground never translated to tenderness above it. Her mother had been a schoolteacher who'd given up her position the day she married, as was expected, as was proper, as was the price women paid for security. Marilyn had watched her mother absorb her father's moods like a shock absorber, smoothing his rough edges, translating his grunts into family decisions, making herself smaller so he could feel larger. She'd watched and learned the fundamental arithmetic of survival. Anger plus resistance equals escalation, but silence plus endurance equals tomorrow. By the time she was 10, Marilyn could read the barometric pressure of her father's temper in the weight of his footsteps on the porch. By 15, she'd perfected the art of becoming invisible, not literally, but functionally, present but unobtrusive, helpful but undemanding, there but not there. She'd met Thomas Osborne at a church social when she was 22. He'd been standing alone by the punch bowl, looking uncomfortable in a borrowed suit jacket, his mechanic's hands still bearing traces of engine grease he couldn't quite scrub away. While other young men had postured and preened, Thomas had simply smiled at her, gentle, genuine, asking nothing. Their courtship had been quiet, their wedding, modest, their marriage, unremarkable by any external measure. But Thomas had given her something her father never had, the freedom to exist at full volume, even if she rarely used it. He'd listened when she spoke, actually listened, his eyes focused on her face, rather than the television or the newspaper or the middle distance. He'd asked her opinion on decisions and then revolutionary concept actually considered it before acting. He'd never raised his hand to her, never raised his voice in anger at her, never made her feel like her presence was a burden he tolerated rather than a gift he'd chosen. For 48 years, Thomas Osborne had loved her with the steady reliability of a heartbeat, until his heart stopped. 9 months ago, April 14th, a Tuesday morning, he'd been underneath Mrs. Patterson's Buick, diagnosing a transmission issue, when the massive coronary hit. Gone before the ambulance arrived. The doctors said he hadn't suffered, as if instantaneous absence was somehow more comforting than prolonged goodbye. The funeral had been attended by half the neighborhood men whose cars Thomas had kept running long past their expiration dates. Women whose husbands Thomas had helped during strikes and layoffs. Young mechanics he'd mentored who'd gone on to open their own shops. They'd filled the small Methodist church, standing room only, testament to a life measured in small kindnesses no one had applauded. Marilyn had sat in the front pew, dry-eyed and silent, absorbing their condolences like she'd absorbed everything else in her 71 years. With grace, with gratitude, with the understanding that grief was another thing women carried privately. The house had felt enormous afterward. Not physically, it was the same modest 3-bedroom ranch they'd bought in 1979, but acoustically. Every creak of floorboard, every hum of refrigerator, every tick of the hallway clock echoed in spaces that Thomas's presence had previously filled. She'd learned to fill the silence with routines. Monday, grocery shopping, always at 9 when the store was least crowded. Tuesday, library, returning books she'd barely read, and checking out new ones she probably wouldn't finish. Wednesday, volunteering at the community center, helping ESL students with English pronunciation. Thursday, cleaning the house didn't get dirty anymore with just her, but the ritual of scrubbing gave her hands something to do. Friday, Thomas's grave, fresh flowers, one-sided conversations about neighborhood gossip and the weather, and the fact that the rosebush he'd planted was finally blooming. Saturday, errands, repairs, the administrative maintenance of continued existence. Sunday, church, then home, then the long afternoon that stretched like taffy into evening. Today was Tuesday, December 31st. Their anniversary would have been their 49th. Thomas had promised her, years ago, that when they retired and finally had money not earmarked for house payments or car repairs or the endless expenses of living, he'd take her somewhere fancy. Rosewood Pavilion? He'd said, reading about it in the local magazine. White tablecloths and everything. You deserve that, Marilyn. You deserve to feel elegant. Someday, he'd said. Someday had run out of time. So Marilyn had gone alone. She'd made a reservation under her own name party of one, and the hostess's momentary confusion had stung less than she'd expected. She'd worn her nicest cardigan, the tan one with the decorative buttons Thomas had always liked. She'd ordered the herb-crusted salmon Thomas would have chosen, medium rare, with the garlic mashed potatoes he'd have pretended not to want but would have stolen bites of from her plate. She'd sat across from an empty chair and honored a promise her dead husband had never been able to keep. The bill had arrived with an unexpected charge. $17. Service enhancement fee, printed in small type at the bottom. Marilyn wasn't poor. Thomas's life insurance and his small pension kept her comfortable enough. But decades of budgeting, of stretching dollars, of being accountable for every expense, had trained her to question discrepancies. Not angrily, not accusatorily, just question. She'd raised her hand to politely get the manager's attention. Christopher Francois had approached with visible irritation, his body language broadcasting annoyance before she'd even spoken. She'd asked, very quietly, what the service enhancement fee covered, explaining she didn't see it mentioned anywhere on the menu. His response had been immediate and withering. It's posted clearly at the entrance. Maybe if you'd paid attention instead of wasting our premium table for an hour with your... He'd caught himself, but Marilyn had understood the unfinished sentence. Your cheap, solitary, pathetic little memorial dinner. She'd tried to apologize, to explain she'd simply missed the sign, that she meant no offense. That's when his hand had moved. Now, walking through the restaurant's entrance into the December rain, Marilyn felt the familiar weight of endurance settling over her shoulders like an old coat. The burning in her cheek would fade. The humiliation would join the catalog of indignities she'd survived. Tomorrow would come, because tomorrow always came. She'd learned long ago that silence wasn't weakness, it was survival. Behind her, she didn't see the man in the black suit stand from table 12. She didn't know Christopher Francois's next 8 minutes had already been decided. She simply walked into the rain, dignified and alone, carrying her pain the way she'd always carried everything, quietly. Jago Silvestri didn't believe in coincidence. He believed in patterns, in debts, in the mathematical precision of cause and effect, in the understanding that every action launched ripples across water that eventually returned to their point of origin, sometimes as gentle waves, sometimes as tsunamis that obliterated shorelines. He'd been watching Christopher Francois for 17 minutes before the slap occurred, not because he'd come to the Rosewood Pavilion looking for trouble. He'd come for the Audiobooks, which the chef, a Sicilian named Bruno, who'd once worked in Palermo, and understood that good food required patience, prepared the way Jago's grandmother had. Braised for hours until the meat surrendered completely, served over saffron risotto that could make a man weep if he allowed himself such indulgences. Jago didn't weep. Hadn't in 30 years. Not since his father's funeral, when he'd been 16 and hadn't yet learned that emotion was a luxury men in his position couldn't afford. Table 12 was his table. Had been for 3 years, ever since he'd had a quiet conversation with the restaurant's owner about the benefits of reserving it permanently. The corner position offered clear sightlines to both entrances. The dim lighting provided natural camouflage. The ambient noise from the kitchen masked conversations. And Bruno, who understood loyalty the way only immigrants and criminals truly understand it, never asked questions about who Jago met or what they discussed over meticulously prepared Italian cuisine. Tonight, Jago had come alone. A rarity, but occasionally necessary. His second in command, Leo, was handling a situation in the warehouse district. His driver, Dimitri, waited outside in the Mercedes, engine running, always ready. Inside, Jago had wanted only silence, good food, and the particular peace that came from watching ordinary people live ordinary lives untouched by the complications his world imposed. Then he'd noticed the woman at table 4. She'd arrived at 7:15, moving with the careful deliberation of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. Older, early 70s, he'd guessed dressed in clothes that were clean but unmistakably outdated, a tan cardigan that had seen better decades, a floral blouse with a pattern that suggested she'd owned it since the 90s, sensible shoes worn soft at the heels. She'd sat alone, arranging her purse carefully on the empty chair across from her, positioning it with the tenderness someone might show a companion. She'd studied the menu with intense concentration, her finger tracing down the listed items, her lips moving slightly as she calculated prices against some internal budget. Jago had recognized loneliness immediately. He'd spent enough time in its company to know its particular posture. Then Christopher Francois had approached her table, and Jago's casual observation had sharpened into focused attention. The manager's body language had telegraphed contempt before he'd spoken a word. The slight backward lean, the crossed arms, the expression of someone forced to interact with an inconvenience rather than a customer. When the woman had asked for tap water, Christopher's eye roll had been visible from 3 tables away. Jago's jaw had tightened fractionally. He'd watched Christopher return to the woman's table twice more over the next 40 minutes. Each interaction had been progressively more dismissive. The exaggerated sigh when she'd needed extra time with the menu. The theatrical check of his watch when she'd asked about ingredients, a legitimate question given she'd mentioned allergies. The borderline hostile tone when delivering her entree, salmon that Christopher had practically dropped onto the table. Jago had stopped tasting his ossobuco. His fork had remained suspended above his plate, forgotten, while his attention had locked onto table 4 with the intensity of a predator tracking wounded prey. No, not prey. A predator tracking another predator who was circling someone defenseless. The bill had arrived. The woman had examined it carefully, then raised her hand with apologetic hesitance. Christopher had approached, radiating irritation, and when she'd asked her question so quietly, Jago had to strain to hear the manager's response had been immediate and vicious. Jago had seen the slap coming 3 full seconds before impact. He'd recognized the particular tension in Christopher's shoulders, the forward shift of weight, the drawing back of the right arm. Violence had its own grammar, and Jago was fluent in every dialect. He could have stopped it, one word, one movement, one subtle intervention. He'd chosen not to, not from cruelty, but from calculation. Because sometimes you needed to see exactly what someone was capable of before you decided what they deserved. Because Christopher Francois needed to commit completely to his choice so there could be no ambiguity, no possibility of misunderstanding, no room for the mercy that came from doubt. The slap had landed with the sound of judgment, and in that frozen moment afterward, the woman staggering, the glasses flying, the room collapsing into horrified silence. Jago had made his decision with the cold finality he applied to all terminal problems. Christopher Francois was going to learn a lesson, the expensive kind, the kind that left marks invisible to doctors but permanent in the architecture of a man's future. Jago had remained motionless while the woman apologized. The victim, seeking forgiveness from her victimizer. The mathematics of that reversal, so common, so predictable, so obscene, had kindled something in Jago's chest that wasn't quite anger but occupied the same space. He'd watched her gather her glasses with trembling hands, watched her straighten with visible pain, watched her walk toward the exit with dignity that wealth couldn't purchase and violence couldn't steal. Then he'd stood. The movement was unhurried but absolute. Jago lifted his black napkin from his lap, folded it precisely, placed it beside his untouched ossobuco. He buttoned his suit jacket single button, Italian cut, tailored in Milan by a man who'd been dressing his family for 3 generations. His hands, decorated with ink that told stories to those who could read them, moved with practiced economy. Around him, the restaurant remained locked in its uncomfortable silence. A few diners had resumed eating, but their movements were mechanical, performative, the motions of people pretending normalcy while their nervous systems still flooded with adrenaline. Christopher had already turned away, heading toward the kitchen, already dismissing the incident, already convinced his authority had been validated rather than revoked. He didn't see Jago walking, didn't hear the almost imperceptible change in the room's atmosphere as other diners registered the man in black moving with predatory purpose, didn't feel the weight of attention that followed Jago like gravity followed mass. Jago reached the entrance just as Marilyn stepped into the December rain. He paused, one hand on the brass door handle, and looked back. His eyes found Christopher across the dining room, held him for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to be noticed, long enough to be remembered, long enough to plant the seed of concern that would bloom into terror soon enough. Then Jago pushed through the door into the cold evening air, following a woman who had no idea she was about to be repaid for a kindness her dead husband had shown a bleeding stranger on a roadside 15 years ago. Debts, in Jago Silvestri's world, always came due. Always. The rain fell in cold, deliberate sheets that turned the sidewalk into a mirror of streetlights and neon. Marilyn stood beneath the restaurant's burgundy awning, one hand pressed to her burning cheek, the other clutching her purse against her chest like a shield that had arrived too late. Her glasses sat crooked on her face. She'd put them back on without checking if the frames had bent, and the world tilted slightly to the left as a result. She needed to call a taxi. Her car was at home. Thomas had always driven when they went anywhere nice, and after he died, she'd maintained the habit of taking cabs for special occasions. It felt respectful somehow, like keeping a promise to a ghost. Her fingers fumbled with the clasp of her purse, searching for the card with the taxi company's number she kept in the side pocket. The cold made her joints ache. The humiliation made everything else ache. Mrs. Osborne. The voice came from behind her, low, quiet, carrying an accent she couldn't quite place. European, maybe. Eastern? The vowels were slightly flattened, the consonants deliberate. Marilyn turned, startled, and found herself looking at a man who seemed assembled from shadows and sharp angles. He stood just outside the awning's protection, rain darkening the shoulders of his black suit jacket, but apparently unconcerned about it. Tall, over 6 feet, with a build that suggested physical capability kept in careful reserve. Dark hair styled back from a face that could have been 35 or 45, the kind of features that didn't age so much as calcify, but it was his eyes that stopped her breath. Dark, almost black in the inadequate lighting, and completely still. Not cold, exactly. Not cruel. Just absent of the warmth that usually animated human faces. Like looking at a statue that had been granted temporary animation but not quite life. The tattoos were visible even in the rain-dimmed light. They crawled up his neck from beneath his collar, geometric patterns and symbols she didn't recognize. More ink decorated the backs of his hands, disappearing under his sleeves. Marilyn took an involuntary step backward. "I'm not going to hurt you," the man said, and despite everything about his appearance that should have terrified her, his tone carried something unexpected. Gentleness. Not the condescending gentleness people used with the elderly, but the careful restraint of someone handling something fragile because he understood its value. "I don't..." Marilyn's voice came out thin, threaded with the tears she'd been holding back. "I don't have any money. I mean, I have some, but I'm not." "I know." He took one step forward, not closing the distance but reducing it slightly. "I'm not here to take anything from you. I'm here to settle a debt. I don't understand." "Your husband." Thomas Osborne. March 2010. Route 70, about 15 miles outside of Cumberland. Marilyn's confusion shifted into something sharper, more focused. "How do you know about..." He stopped for a man on the roadside, bleeding, hurt badly. "Your husband didn't call the police, didn't ask questions, just drove that man to the hospital. Waited until he was admitted. then left without giving his name. Jago's expression didn't change, but something in his voice softened microscopically. That man was me. The rain intensified, drumming against the awning like impatient fingers. Somewhere down the street, a car horn bleated. A group of young people hurried past, laughing, oblivious, their umbrellas bumping together. Marilyn stared at the man in front of her, trying to reconcile his words with her memories. She remembered that night. Thomas had come home at nearly midnight, his jacket covered in blood that wasn't his. She'd been terrified, thought he'd been in an accident, but he'd explained calmly while washing his hands at the kitchen sink. A man on the roadside, hurt, maybe from a car accident or a fight. Thomas hadn't been sure. No cell phone signal. So he'd driven the man to Cumberland Medical Center, made sure he was breathing the whole way, talked to him to keep him conscious. "You never ask for help you might not get," Thomas had said, scrubbing blood from beneath his fingernails. "You just give it when someone needs it." She'd washed his jacket twice before the stains came out. "Thomas never mentioned," Marilyn started, "because I never told him who I was, what I was. He probably assumed I was a victim of some random violence." Jago's mouth moved in what might have been a smile on a different face, but here looked more like muscle memory of the expression. "He was wrong. The men who hurt me meant to kill me. They failed. Thomas's intervention is why. I still don't understand why I've been looking for him for years, quietly. No pressure, no urgency, just searching. Found out about his death 6 months ago. Found out about you shortly after." Jago glanced back at the restaurant, his jaw tightening fractionally. "Tonight, I came here for dinner. Saw you sitting alone. Didn't realize the connection until I started putting pieces together. The name on your credit card, your age, Cumberland address." Marilyn's hand drifted unconsciously to her cheek, still hot and swollen. "Then I saw what that man did to you." Jago's voice didn't rise, didn't sharpen, but something in it shifted like ice forming over deep water. "And I realized the universe was giving me an opportunity to settle an old debt. I don't want anyone hurt because of me," Marilyn said quickly. Too quickly. The words tumbled out with desperate urgency. "Please. It was just a misunderstanding. I probably shouldn't have questioned the bill. I was taking up a good table for too long. Stop." The single word carried enough quiet authority that Marilyn's voice died immediately. Jago stepped fully under the awning now, close enough that she could see the rain beaded on his jacket, close enough to notice the small scar above his left eyebrow, close enough to understand that this was a man who'd survived things most people didn't survive. "You're doing it again," he said softly. "Apologizing for existing. Making yourself smaller so other people can feel bigger. Your husband saved my life, Mrs. Osborne, not because he knew who I was, not because he expected payment, because he saw someone who needed help and provided it without calculation. Thomas was good," Marilyn whispered. "Yes, he was." Jago's expression remained neutral, but his voice carried conviction. "Which means you don't deserve what happened in there. You don't deserve to apologize to the man who assaulted you. And you certainly don't deserve to go home tonight believing you did something wrong. What are you going to do?" "Nothing you need to worry about. Nothing that will touch you." Jago reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a card, plain white, no logo, just a phone number printed in black ink. "But if you ever need anything, ever, you call this number." Marilyn took the card with trembling fingers. "Your husband gave me my life back when he had no reason to," Jago said. "The least I can do is make sure his widow is treated with the respect she deserves." A black Mercedes pulled up to the curb, silent and sleek. The driver, a broad-shouldered man with Slavic features, stepped out with an umbrella, opening it smoothly. "Dmitri will take you home," Jago said. "Wherever you need to go. I can call a taxi." "I know you can, but you won't need to." It wasn't a command. It wasn't even a strong suggestion. It was simply a statement of what would happen next, delivered with the certainty of someone accustomed to reality conforming to his decisions. Marilyn looked at the car, then at Jago, then back at the restaurant where Christopher Francois presumably continued his evening, ignorant of the reckoning approaching on quiet feet. "Thank you," she finally managed. Jago nodded once. Then he turned and walked back toward the restaurant entrance, his figure merging with the rain and shadows until Marilyn couldn't distinguish him from the darkness. Dmitri held the umbrella over her silently, gesturing toward the open car door. Marilyn climbed into the Mercedes leather seats, subtle warmth, the faint scent of expensive cologne, and realized with distant surprise that she wasn't afraid. She was something else entirely, vindicated. Christopher Francois stood in the kitchen's prep area, breathing hard, his right hand still tingling from the impact. The adrenaline coursed through him like voltage, sharp, clarifying, addictive. His heart hammered against his ribs. His skin felt too tight. Every nerve ending buzzed with the particular electricity that came from exercising power without consequence. He'd done it. Actually done it. Slapped that insufferable old woman right across her wrinkled face, and the world hadn't ended. The restaurant hadn't collapsed. Management hadn't intervened. The guests had gasped and frozen and then, as he'd known they would, resumed their dinners with downcast eyes and careful silence. Because that's what people did. They witnessed. They judged quietly. But they never acted. Jesus, Christopher. The voice came from behind him, Tommy, one of the line cooks, a heavy-set kid with perpetual sweat stains and culinary school debt he'd probably never escape. She's like 70. She was being difficult. Christopher rolled his shoulders, adjusting his vest, smoothing his hair back into place. His reflection in the stainless steel refrigerator showed him exactly what he needed to see. Composed, authoritative, in control. People like that. They come in here thinking this is some diner where they can nickel and dime everything. Someone needs to teach them standards. By hitting them? Tommy's voice carried disbelief rather than judgment, the tone of someone watching a car accident in slow motion. By establishing boundaries. Christopher turned, fixing Tommy with the look that had made 3 servers quit in the past 6 months. You want to work at Denny's your whole life? You want to serve entitled senior citizens their early bird specials and smile while they leave you a $1 tip? Or do you want to work somewhere with actual standards? Tommy looked away. I just think maybe you think too much. That's your problem. Christopher brushed past him toward the swinging door that led back to the dining room. Get back to your station. We have a full house tonight. The kitchen staff parted for him silently, Bruno at the stove, deliberately not looking up from his risotto. Elena prepping desserts with focused intensity. Marcus, the dishwasher, scrubbing plates with sudden vigor. All of them performing the theater of not having opinions. Christopher felt the familiar satisfaction of commanded respect. They feared him. Good. Fear meant efficiency. Fear meant no one questioned his decisions or second-guessed his authority or made his job more difficult than it already was. He pushed through the door back into the dining room, his professional smile reassembling itself automatically. The atmosphere felt different than when he'd left. Not worse, exactly. Just thicker, like the air pressure had changed. Several diners glanced up as he passed, then quickly away. Table 7, the couple by the window, seemed deeply invested in studying their wine glasses. Table 3, the business executive and his wife had created a sudden fascination with the dessert menu despite having just received their entrees. Christopher's smile tightened fractionally. They'd get over it. People always did. By tomorrow, this would be a dinner party anecdote. You'll never believe what we saw at Rosewood Pavilion last night. They'd tell it with shocked voices and wide eyes, performing their outrage for friends and colleagues who'd make appropriately scandalized sounds while secretly filing the information away as gossip rather than injustice. No one would call corporate. No one would leave negative reviews, not about this, anyway. They'd complain about overcooked steaks or slow service or parking inconvenience, but they'd never publicly admit they'd witnessed assault and done nothing, because admitting that would make them complicit. Christopher understood human psychology. It was his greatest professional asset. People were predictable. They wanted to be told what to do, where to sit, what to order. They wanted authority figures to make decisions so they didn't have to. And when authority figures occasionally overstepped, people rationalized it, justified it, found ways to blame the victim rather than question the system. That old woman had been difficult, had wasted his time, had questioned a legitimate charge with the audacity of someone who thought their limited budget entitled them to special treatment. In a way, he'd done her a favor, taught her a lesson about knowing your place, about understanding when you're outclassed, about having the self-awareness to recognize which establishments were beyond your social station. He made a mental note to add her credit card to the restaurant's informal blacklist. She wouldn't be welcome back. Not that she'd likely try to return after tonight's embarrassment. Christopher moved through the dining room with deliberate confidence, pausing at table 9 to check on the young couple. How is everything this evening? The duck confit prepared to your satisfaction? The woman smiled nervously. It's wonderful. Thank you. Excellent. Please let me know if you need anything at all. He placed the slightest emphasis on anything, a subtle reminder that he controlled their experience here, that his goodwill determined the quality of their evening. At table 11, An older gentleman dining alone looked up as Christopher approached. Their eyes met briefly, and Christopher saw something in the man's expression that looked uncomfortably like pity. Or was it contempt? Hard to tell with old people. They had resting faces that communicated disappointment with the entire modern world. "Sir, is your fillet prepared correctly?" "It's fine." The man's voice was clipped. He returned his attention to his plate with aggressive finality. Christopher moved on, unbothered. You couldn't please everyone. Some people came to restaurants actively looking for reasons to be offended, to feel superior, to judge service industry workers from their elevated positions as customers. He checked his watch, a Tag Heuer he'd saved 6 months to afford, stainless steel and sharp angles that caught light beautifully. 8:47 p.m. The dinner rush would continue for another hour, then taper off. He'd stay until close 10:30, then head to Sidebar, the cocktail lounge 3 blocks over where other restaurant managers congregated to decompress. He'd have a story tonight, a good one. The difficult customer he'd finally stood up to, he'd edit out the slap, obviously. Frame it as a verbal confrontation where he'd firmly but professionally established boundaries. His colleagues would nod appreciatively, commiserating about entitled customers and the endless patience their profession demanded. Christopher allowed himself a private smile as he headed back toward the kitchen to check on table turnaround times. The evening had started complicated, but he'd handled it, made the tough decision. Established authority when others might have folded to misplaced sympathy. This was leadership. This was what separated managers who got promoted from managers who stagnated in the same position for decades. Christopher Francois was going places. He could feel it. Behind him, the restaurant's entrance doors opened with a whisper of brass hinges and December cold. He didn't turn around, didn't see the man in the black suit step back inside. Rain still beaded on his shoulders. Didn't notice how the temperature in the room seemed to drop 5 degrees in as many seconds. Didn't observe the way conversations died mid-sentence, the way forks paused halfway to mouths, the way every person who'd witnessed the slap suddenly understood that something far worse than discomfort was about to unfold. Christopher pushed through the kitchen door, already thinking about his post-shift drink, completely unaware that his comfortable life had approximately 4 minutes left to exist. The change was molecular. One moment, the rosewood pavilion hummed with the manufactured ambiance of expensive dining, the gentle clink of silverware against porcelain, the murmur of polite conversation, the subtle jazz filtering through hidden speakers. The next moment, something shifted in the room's fundamental chemistry. Not loud, not dramatic, just absolute. Jago Silvestri stood just inside the entrance, rain still glistening on his black suit, and every person who'd witnessed the slap felt their nervous system respond to a threat they couldn't consciously identify. The woman at table 3, the one in pearls who'd covered her mouth earlier, felt her hand freeze around her wine glass. Her husband, mid-sentence in some story about quarterly earnings, simply stopped talking, not because he'd been interrupted, but because his hindbrain had suddenly prioritized survival over social performance. At table 9, the young couple who'd been trying to reclaim their romantic evening felt the air thicken. The man's hand found his girlfriend's across the table, squeezing with unconscious urgency. She squeezed back, both of them staring at the figure by the door with the fascinated horror of people watching a predator enter the savannah. Near the window, the elderly gentleman who'd half risen during the slap sat completely still now, his meal forgotten, his face carrying the expression of someone who recognized what was about to happen and understood there was nothing to be done except bear witness. Even the staff felt it. Elena, clearing plates from table 6, stopped mid-motion, her hands locked around a stack of dishes. She'd worked restaurants for 12 years, had dealt with health inspections, grease fires, verbal abuse from chefs, and handsy customers, but she'd never felt anything quite like the cold certainty that filled the room when that man walked back inside. Bruno, visible through the kitchen's service window, made brief eye contact with Jago. Something passed between them, not recognition exactly, but acknowledgement. The way soldiers from different armies might nod to each other across neutral ground. Bruno's hand stilled on his wooden spoon. He didn't call out a warning, didn't reach for his phone. He simply witnessed, and in his witnessing, made a choice about whose side of history he wanted to occupy. Jago moved forward, not quickly, not aggressively, but with the unhurried certainty of tides or gravity or other forces that didn't negotiate with resistance. His footsteps were nearly silent on the hardwood floor, expensive Italian leather shoes that cost more than most of the diner's monthly car payments, custom-made in Milan by a cobbler who'd learned his trade from his grandfather. He unbuttoned his suit jacket as he walked. Single button, Italian cut, the fabric moving like liquid shadow. The gesture was practical, not threatening. But something about it, the casual preparation, the matter-of-fact adjustment, communicated inevitability more clearly than any verbal threat could have. Table after table, conversations died as Jago passed. He wasn't looking at them, wasn't acknowledging them. But his presence demanded attention, the way a fire alarm demands attention impossible to ignore, wired directly into ancient survival instincts that predated language. The tattoos on his hands caught light as he moved geometric patterns and symbols that told stories to those who could read them. A crescent moon intersected with 3 lines on his right hand. 3 debts settled through blood. A small cross on his left thumb, remembrance of the dead who'd earned it. Ink that wasn't decoration but documentation. A visible ledger of a life lived in margins most people never glimpsed. Jago's eyes scanned the dining room with methodical precision, cataloging exits, counting staff, assessing witness placement. Not with paranoia, but with the automatic threat assessment of someone who'd survived situations where such awareness meant the difference between walking out and being carried out. He located Christopher through the kitchen's service window, visible for just a moment, gesturing at something, his mouth moving in what was probably criticism disguised as management. Jago adjusted his trajectory slightly, moving toward the kitchen entrance with the same unhurried purpose. At table 7, the young man, the one who'd been laughing with his girlfriend before the slap, felt a sudden, urgent need to leave. Not consciously, not logically, but his body was screaming at him to remove himself from whatever was about to happen. His girlfriend felt it too. Her eyes found his, wide and frightened, silently asking, "Should we go?" They stayed, not from courage, but from the same terrible curiosity that makes people slow down at car accidents. The need to see, to know, to bear witness to the moments when ordinary reality fractures into something else. The kitchen door swung open. Christopher emerged, scanning the dining room with proprietary satisfaction, already thinking past the evening's unpleasantness to his post-shift drink and the edited version of events he'd share with colleagues. He took 3 steps into the dining room before he noticed the silence. His professional smile faltered. His eyes swept the room, trying to diagnose the problem. Had someone choked? Had a fire alarm gone off that he somehow missed? Then he saw Jago. The man in black, standing perfectly still 15 feet away, rein still beaded on his shoulders, hands loose at his sides, face carrying the neutral expression of someone performing a task that required no emotional investment. Christopher's brain tried to process the information, tried to place the face. Had this man been dining here earlier? Was he someone important? A food critic? A corporate representative? Someone who'd witnessed? Oh no. Recognition arrived not as memory but as instinct. This man had been at table 12. Christopher hadn't paid attention. The corner table, always occupied by quiet diners who tipped adequately but never caused problems. He'd registered the figure only peripherally, the way you register furniture in a room you pass through daily. But now, with the man's full attention focused on him like a spotlight, Christopher felt the first cold tendril of genuine fear uncurl in his chest. The room held its breath. Jago took 1 step forward. Just one. A reduction of distance so slight it barely qualified as movement. But something about it, the measured deliberation, the complete absence of hesitation, made Christopher's mouth go dry. "Mr. Francois." Jago's voice carried easily across the silent dining room despite its low volume. Accented, controlled, containing no anger but somehow more frightening for its absence. "We need to talk." Christopher's hands moved automatically to adjust his vest, smooth his hair, perform the physical tics that usually restored his confidence. They didn't work. His fingers trembled. His throat clicked when he swallowed. I'm sorry, do I know you?" Christopher's voice came out higher than intended, strained with the effort of maintaining professional courtesy while his nervous system flooded with adrenaline. "No." Jago took another step. Still not aggressive, still not rushing, just closing distance with the patience of someone who knew his target had nowhere to go. "But I know you. I know exactly what you are." The words landed like physical blows. Christopher tried to smile, tried to activate the charm, the smooth talking, the conflict resolution skills they'd taught him in management training. "Sir, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. If you have a complaint about your dining experience, I'd be happy to—" "The woman you struck." Jago's interruption was surgical, not loud, not rude, just absolute. "Tell me about her." The cold in Christopher's chest expanded into his limbs. Around them, 40 witnesses waited for his answer. Christopher's mouth opened, closed, opened again. His brain scrambled for the right response, the professional deflection, the smooth explanation, the careful repositioning of narrative that had saved him from accountability dozens of times before. But every polished phrase died before reaching his tongue, suffocated by the weight of Jago's unwavering stare. There was a misunderstanding with a customer, Christopher finally managed, his voice carrying the false reasonableness of someone trying to convince himself as much as his audience. She was being difficult about her bill. I shouldn't have lost my temper, but she was being difficult. Jago repeated the words, with surgical precision, not as a question but as evidence being entered into record. He took another step forward, close enough now that Christopher could see the details he'd missed from across the room, the small scar above Jago's left eyebrow, the absolute stillness of his pupils, the way his hands hung loose but ready at his sides. A 71-year-old woman asked a question about her bill, and that constitutes being difficult? She was questioning a legitimate charge. The service enhancement fee is clearly posted at, I read the sign. Another step. Jago was now within arm's reach, towering over Christopher by 3 inches that felt like 3 feet. Posted in 8-point font on a placard partially obscured by the hostess stand, printed in gray text on cream background. Designed, one might think, to be overlooked until after the meal, when customers feel socially obligated to pay, rather than cause a scene. Christopher's face flushed. That's not, we're completely transparent about our... She asked a question. A polite question. I heard her. Jago's voice dropped lower, forcing Christopher to strain to hear despite their proximity. I watched you approach her table 3 times throughout her meal. Watched you treat her like an inconvenience rather than a customer. Watched you roll your eyes when she needed extra time. Sigh when she asked about ingredients. Practically throw her entree on the table. I was busy. We have a full house tonight, and then she questioned a charge she didn't understand. Jago leaned forward fractionally. Not a threat, just a closing of space that made breathing feel more difficult. And you decided she needed to be taught a lesson. About standards. About knowing her place. About the consequences of wasting the valuable time of someone as important as Christopher Francois. The way Jago spoke his name with surgical contempt, each syllable isolated and examined, made Christopher's stomach drop. It wasn't like that, Christopher said, but even he could hear how weak it sounded. She wouldn't stop arguing, and I reacted. I made a mistake. You slapped her. 3 words, flat, final, across the face, hard enough that her glasses flew off, hard enough that everyone in this room heard it, hard enough that a woman who'd been sitting quietly, bothering no one, eating a solitary meal in memory of her dead husband, staggered backward and nearly fell. Christopher felt the blood drain from his face. How do you... Her husband saved my life 15 years ago, Jago said, and something in his voice shifted, not louder, but somehow heavier, carrying the weight of debts that couldn't be measured in currency. Didn't know who I was. Didn't ask for reward. Just saw someone bleeding on a roadside and helped because that's what decent people do. The dining room had gone so quiet Christopher could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. I've been looking for him for years, Jago continued. To thank him, to repay the debt. Found out 6 months ago he was dead. Heart attack. Sudden. His widow living alone on his small pension, trying to stretch his life insurance. Volunteering at community centers because she doesn't know what else to do with days that feel too long. Christopher tried to step back, found his legs wouldn't obey. Tonight, Jago said, his eyes never leaving Christopher's face. She came here to honor him. Their anniversary. A promise he'd made to bring her someplace elegant that he never got to keep. So she came alone, ordered his favorite meal, sat across from an empty chair, and tried very hard not to cry. I didn't know, Christopher's voice cracked. I didn't know who she was. If you'd known she was protected, you wouldn't have touched her. Jago's interruption was gentle, almost kind, which made it infinitely more devastating. But you had no problem striking a woman you believed was powerless, alone, defenseless. Someone you calculated would absorb your violence and apologize for causing trouble. Christopher opened his mouth. Nothing came out. That's what you calculated, wasn't it? Jago tilted his head slightly, studying Christopher the way an entomologist studies a pinned insect. That she'd take it, that no one would intervene, that you could exercise your little bit of borrowed authority without consequence because people like her don't fight back. Please, Christopher hated the pleading in his voice but couldn't stop it. Please, I'm sorry. I'll apologize. I'll pay for her meal. I'll whatever you want. Just, what I want, Jago said quietly, is for you to understand something very clearly. He raised his right hand not to strike, but slowly, deliberately, letting Christopher see it coming. Christopher flinched violently, his arms coming up defensively, a whimper escaping his throat before he could stop it. Jago's hand stopped inches from Christopher's face, palm open, fingers spread. That's what powerlessness feels like, Jago said. Knowing something terrible might happen and being unable to prevent it. Flinching, whimpering, preparing for pain you can't avoid. He lowered his hand. Christopher realized he was shaking. Jago stepped back slightly, not far, just enough to address the room rather than only Christopher. His voice rose, not to a shout but to a carrying volume that ensured every witness heard every word with crystalline clarity. That woman, Jago said, his accent sharpening the consonants into edges, is named Marilyn Osborne. She is 71 years old. She is a widow. She volunteers teaching English to immigrants. She has never harmed anyone. She came here tonight to honor her dead husband's memory. He paused, letting the information settle into the consciousness of 40 witnesses, and she is under my protection. The words detonated in the silence, not loud, not dramatic, but carrying the weight of absolute authority, the kind that didn't require explanation or justification because it predated both. The kind that rewrote social contracts and shifted power structures with the finality of natural law. At table 3, the businessman went pale. He knew exactly what those words meant, what they implied, what world they came from, and what consequences that world imposed. At table 9, the young woman gripped her boyfriend's hand so hard her knuckles whitened. She didn't know the specifics, but she understood the fundamental truth. Everything had just changed. Even Bruno, watching from the kitchen, felt something shift. He'd known men like Jago in the old country, men who operated outside the law not as criminals but as a parallel system of justice older and more permanent than badges and courtrooms. Christopher staggered backward, his hip hitting a table, rattling the glassware. I swear I didn't know she was protected? Jago finished. No, you didn't, because you thought she was nobody, and that's exactly the problem. He let the words hang. Then, with deliberate casualness, Jago reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew his phone. He didn't unlock it, didn't dial, simply held it in his hand, the gesture somehow more threatening than any weapon. One call, Jago said softly. That's all it takes. Christopher understood immediately. One call, and his world ended. Jago held the phone with the casual certainty of someone holding a loaded gun. He didn't need to explain what one call meant. Didn't need to detail the networks of obligation and fear that radiated from his position like spokes from a wheel's hub. The knowledge lived in the room's collective unconscious. Everyone understood that some people operated outside normal channels, that some debts were collected without lawyers or police, that some justice was administered in spaces the law couldn't reach. Christopher stared at the phone with the hollow-eyed recognition of a man watching his execution being prepared. Please, he whispered. Please don't I have rent. I have student loans. I can't lose this job, I can't. You can't? Jago's eyebrows rose fractionally. Interesting priority. You're worried about your job. Not about the woman you assaulted. Not about apologizing. Not about making amends. Your job. I'll apologize. I'll do whatever you want. Jago raised one finger. Christopher's voice died instantly. The gesture was minimal, barely a movement, but carried the authority of a judge's gavel. Silence fell so complete that the kitchen's background noise, the sizzle of pans, the rush of water, the clatter of plates, sounded deafening by contrast. Jago pressed a single button. The phone screen illuminated his face from below, casting shadows that made his features look carved from stone. He held it to his ear. 1 ring. 2. Christopher felt his bladder threaten to release. His hands gripped the table behind him so hard his knuckles went bloodless. Every molecule of his being screamed to run, but his legs had locked in place, reduced to spectator status in his own catastrophe. It's me, Jago said into the phone. His voice carried clearly despite the low volume. I'm at Rosewood Pavilion. I need Richard here. Now. A pause. Someone speaking on the other end, words Christopher couldn't hear but could imagine. Compliance. Immediate response. The kind of urgency reserved for emergencies and commands from people whose requests weren't optional. 5 minutes, Jago said. Thank you, He ended the call and returned the phone to his jacket pocket with the same unhurried precision he'd used to remove it. Christopher tried to speak. His throat produced only a clicking sound. "Richard Castellano," Jago said, addressing Christopher but speaking loud enough for the room to hear. "Owns this restaurant. Also owns the Maritime on 5th Street, Bella Terra in the financial district, and 6 other establishments across the city. You know this, of course. You've probably met him twice. Once when you were hired. Once at the holiday party last year where you drank too much Prosecco and told him about your 5-year plan." Christopher's face went from white to gray. "Richard is an old friend," Jago continued, that same measured tone that made every word feel like pages being turned in a ledger. "We have history, the kind where favors are remembered, where debts are honored, where a single phone call at 8:47 on a Tuesday night gets answered on the second ring." From the kitchen, Bruno appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on his apron. He didn't intervene, didn't speak, just positioned himself where he could watch, bearing witness with the gravity of someone who understood this moment's importance. At table 3, the businessman pulled out his wallet and dropped $300 bills on the table, more than enough to cover their barely touched meal. His wife was already standing, purse clutched to her chest. They moved toward the exit with the quick, quiet desperation of people fleeing a building they suspected might collapse. Other diners shifted uncomfortably, uncertain whether they should leave or stay, whether witnessing made them complicit or whether departing made them cowards. Jago's eyes tracked the couple's exit without comment, then returned to Christopher with the inevitability of a spotlight. "You made a calculation tonight," Jago said. "You decided that woman was weak enough to abuse without consequence, that she'd absorb your violence and apologize, that the room full of witnesses would remain silent, that your authority protected you from accountability." Christopher's mouth worked soundlessly. "You were correct on 2 counts, Jago acknowledged. "She did apologize. The witnesses did remain silent, but you miscalculated the most important variable." "What?" Christopher managed to rasp. "You assumed no one cared." The restaurant's front entrance opened. Cold December air rushed in, carrying rain and the smell of wet pavement. A man entered with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to moving quickly, late 50s, gray hair immaculately styled, wearing a Burberry trench coat over what was clearly an expensive suit hastily thrown on. Richard Castellano. His eyes found Jago immediately. Whatever expression he'd arrived with, concern, confusion, irritation at being summoned, evaporated when he processed the scene. Jago standing calm and still. Christopher backed against a table, shaking. The frozen dining room, the weight of something irreversible hanging in the air like smoke. Richard's face hardened. He crossed the dining room in 8 strides, not acknowledging any of the remaining diners. His attention locked on Jago with the focus of someone receiving battlefield orders. "Jago." His voice carried respect edged with wariness. "What happened?" "Your manager," Jago said, gesturing at Christopher without looking at him. "Struck a customer, a 71-year-old woman, across the face, in front of a room full of witnesses." Richard's eyes cut to Christopher. "Is this true?" Christopher opened his mouth, closed it. The lie he'd been constructing, the softened version, the context-heavy explanation, died unspoken. Because Richard wasn't asking him. Richard was asking Jago. And everyone in the room understood whose answer would be believed. "It's true," Bruno called from the kitchen doorway. His accented English carried the weight of immigrant honor, the kind that couldn't be bought or intimidated. "I saw it. Everyone saw it." Richard's jaw clenched. He turned slowly to face Christopher, and in that rotation, Christopher saw his entire future collapse, like a building imploding career. References, reputation, the carefully constructed identity he'd spent a decade building. "You're fired," Richard said. The words came out flat, final, carrying no anger because anger implied emotional investment. This was simply administrative necessity. Effective immediately. Security will escort you out. You have 5 minutes to collect your personal belongings. "Richard, please." Christopher lurched forward. "Please, I made a mistake. One mistake. I've worked here for 3 years. I've increased revenue 18%. You struck a customer." Richard's voice cut through the pleading like a scalpel. "In my restaurant. In front of witnesses. Creating liability that could cost me this business and 5 others. You're done." He pulled out his phone, pressed a button. "Security to the main dining room. Immediately." Christopher's knees buckled. He caught himself on the table, barely, his breathing coming in ragged gasps that sounded close to sobs. Two men in black suits appeared from the restaurant's back hallway, security that higher-end establishments kept discreet but present. They moved to flank Christopher with practiced efficiency. "Wait," Christopher gasped, looking at Jago with desperate, drowning eyes. "Please. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Tell him. Tell him." I apologized. "Tell him." Jago's expression didn't change. "You apologize to me. The person you owe apology to went home an hour ago. Alone. Still carrying the mark of your hand on her face." The security guards took Christopher's arms gently but firmly. "Please," Christopher's voice broke completely. "Please, I have nothing without this job. Nothing. I can't. Where do I?" Richard's face remained granite. "You should have thought about that before you put your hands on someone who couldn't fight back." The guards walked Christopher toward the exit, his feet dragging, his shoulders heaving with barely contained sobs. The remaining diners watched in silence, some with satisfaction, some with discomfort, all with the understanding that they'd witnessed the kind of justice that rarely played out so immediately, so completely. The door closed behind Christopher Francois with a soft click that sounded like a coffin ceiling. Richard turned to Jago. "The woman. Is she all right? Physically, she'll recover. The rest." Jago shrugged slightly. "That takes longer. I'll send compensation. Full refund, obviously. And additional—" "She won't want your money," Jago interrupted gently. "But a formal apology. In writing. Acknowledgement that this happened and that you've taken action. That might help." Richard nodded. "Consider it done." He paused. "Thank you for calling me." "You're welcome." Richard looked around the disrupted dining room, calculating damage control, reputation management, the careful reconstruction of normalcy. "I should address the remaining guests." "You should," Jago agreed. Richard moved toward the center of the room, already shifting into public relations mode, his face rearranging into appropriate contrition. Jago turned toward the exit. Bruno caught his eye from the kitchen doorway. The chef nodded once respect between men who understood that some debts existed outside legal frameworks, some justice operated beyond courtroom walls. Jago nodded back. Then he walked out into the December rain, his work here complete, the debt to Thomas Osborne partially paid. Behind him, Richard Castellano began explaining to shocked diners that the restaurant would comp everyone's meals tonight, that what they'd witnessed was unacceptable, that Rosewood Pavilion's standards were being reinforced effective immediately. But Jago wasn't listening. He had one more stop to make before the night ended. The rain had intensified to a steady downpour by the time Jago reached his Mercedes. Dimitri stood beside the driver's door, umbrella raised, water streaming off the edges in silver sheets. He'd been waiting for nearly an hour without complaint, without checking his phone, without the fidgeting that lesser men displayed. Patience was one of many reasons Dimitri had been in Jago's employ for 7 years. "Everything handled?" Dimitri's Russian accent thickened consonants, softened vowels. "The immediate problem, yes." Jago accepted the umbrella, gesturing for Dimitri to get in the car. But not completely. They pulled away from the curb, the Mercedes moving through rain-slicked streets with the quiet confidence of German engineering. City lights reflected in puddles, turning the road into a moving painting of amber and red. Jago sat in the back seat, looking out the window but not seeing the passing storefronts and traffic lights. His mind was working through calculations, measuring appropriate responses, weighing the difference between justice and vengeance. Christopher Francois had lost his job, would lose his references, would find his name quietly circulated through the city's restaurant networks, not officially blacklisted, but whispered about, marked with the invisible scarlet letter that meant no serious establishment would touch him. That was economic consequence. Necessary, immediate, but insufficient. Because Christopher hadn't just violated policy or damaged property. He'd raised his hand against someone defenseless, had exercised violence from a position of power against someone with none, had done it publicly, confidently, expecting the world to either approve or ignore. Men like that required lessons that left permanent marks. Not physical marks. Jago wasn't that crude, and Marilyn had specifically requested no violence, but permanent nonetheless. The kind of marks carried in posture and psychology, the kind that changed how a man saw himself when mirrors showed his reflection. "Where to?" Dimitri asked, eyes on the rearview mirror. "Christopher Francois' apartment," Jago said. "I have the address." Dimitri didn't ask how Jago had obtained it. Men in their position had access to information that others assumed was private. Phone records, lease agreements, employment histories, all available to those who knew which doors to knock on, which palms to grease, which favors to call in. 20 minutes later, they pulled up outside a modern apartment complex in the city's transitional neighborhood, the kind of building that marketed itself as luxury, while offering amenities that were merely adequate. Christopher's address placed him on the 4th floor, Unit 412. Jago stepped out of the Mercedes into rain that had softened to mist. The building's entrance required a key fob. Jago didn't have one. He pressed the call button for Unit 108, a number chosen randomly but strategically. Ground floor. Likely an older tenant who'd been here longest. Yes? A woman's voice. Elderly. Cautious. Delivery, Jago said. I need someone to buzz me in. A pause. Then the door clicked, open the eternal weakness of security systems that relied on human judgment and people's fundamental desire to be helpful. The elevator smelled like cleaning solution and old carpet. Jago rode it to the 4th floor, his reflection multiplying in the mirrored walls, a dozen versions of himself in black suits, watching, waiting. Unit 412's door was generic beige, identical to every other unit on the floor except for the brass numbers. No welcome mat, no decorative wreath. The door of someone who saw apartments as temporary stations rather than homes. Jago knocked. 3 times. Firm but not aggressive. Silence. He knocked again. The door cracked open 2 inches, security chain engaged. Christopher's face appeared in the gap, eyes red-rimmed, hair disheveled, still wearing his work clothes but with the vest removed and shirt partially unbuttoned. What? His voice died when he recognized who stood in the hallway. We're not finished, Jago said quietly. I lost my job. What more do you want? The words came out hoarse, defeated, but with an edge of resentment threading through the surrender. To give you a choice. Christopher stared through the crack, confusion joining the fear in his expression. You can disappear, Jago continued. Leave this city. Tonight. Tomorrow at latest. Find somewhere else to rebuild your life. Somewhere your reputation hasn't preceded you. Somewhere no one knows what you did. Or... Christopher's voice was barely audible. Or you stay, and every restaurant owner in this city receives a very detailed account of tonight's events. Not just that you were fired, but why. The full story, the elderly widow, the memorial dinner, the slap that everyone witnessed, the cowardice when confronted. Christopher's face crumpled. That's you're destroying my entire career. Everything I've worked for. No, Jago corrected gently. You destroyed your career when you raised your hand. I'm simply ensuring the consequences match the action. I apologized. To me, not to her. Jago leaned closer to the crack in the door, his voice dropping to something almost intimate. You apologized when you realized I had power, when you understood there would be consequences. But the woman you struck? You never thought she deserved apology. You thought she deserved what she got. Christopher's mouth worked soundlessly. Here's what happens next, Jago said. Tomorrow morning, you will write a letter to Marilyn Osborne. A real letter, handwritten, taking full responsibility. No excuses. No context. No, but she was difficult. Just acknowledgement of what you did and genuine remorse. Okay. Yes, I'll do that. You'll deliver it to her personally. Christopher's eyes widened. I can't. She'll call the police. I'll be arrested for... You'll knock on her door. You'll hand her the letter. You'll say, I'm sorry for what I did. You deserved better. Then you'll leave. If she wants to call the police, that's her right. If she accepts your apology, that's her mercy. But you'll face her. You'll see what your violence looked like from her perspective. And if I do this, if I apologize, then you leave the city anyway, Jago said. But you leave with the possibility of redemption. The knowledge that you faced what you did, that you tried, however inadequately, to make amends. That's not a choice, Christopher said bitterly. That's just 2 different ways of destroying my life. No, Jago's voice hardened fractionally. Destroying your life would be breaking both your hands so you could never work in service industry again. Would be ensuring every apartment application you submit gets mysteriously rejected. Would be having men visit you monthly to remind you of debts that can never be fully paid. He let that sink in. What I'm offering, Jago continued, softer now, is consequence with the possibility of growth, pain with the opportunity for wisdom. You can become someone who learns from this, who carries the shame but uses it to become better. Or you can become someone who runs from responsibility and spends the rest of his life bitter about injustice he brought upon himself. Christopher sagged against the doorframe. You have until tomorrow night to decide, Jago said. Leave the city and never return. Or deliver that apology and then leave the city. Either way, Christopher Francois's career in this city ends tonight. Only you get to choose whether your conscience follows you, or whether you leave that here too. He stepped back from the door. How will I know where she lives? Christopher asked weakly. Jago reached into his jacket and withdrew a piece of paper, Marilyn's address, written in precise block letters. He slid it through the crack in the door. It fell to the floor inside the apartment. Tomorrow, Jago said, before sunset. Decide who you want to be. He turned and walked back toward the elevator, leaving Christopher staring after him through the narrow opening, holding a piece of paper that felt heavier than any weight he'd ever carried. Marilyn sat in her living room, tea cooling in a cup she'd forgotten she was holding. The house was quiet except for the rain pattering against windows and the soft tick of Thomas's old clock in the hallway. She'd showered when she got home, scrubbed her face until the skin felt raw, trying to wash away the burning handprint that had finally faded from visible red to a dull ache beneath the surface. But some marks didn't wash away. She kept replaying the moment, not the slap itself, but the seconds before. The way Christopher's face had transformed from irritation to rage, the way his hand had drawn back, the way she'd known what was coming but hadn't been fast enough or strong enough to prevent it. The helplessness haunted her more than the pain. Her phone sat on the side table, silent. Part of her expected it to ring police maybe, asking for a statement, or the restaurant, calling with legal threats disguised as apologies. Or even the man in the black suit, though she didn't know what he'd call to say. But the phone remained quiet, and the rain continued its steady percussion, and Marilyn sat with her cooling tea and the particular loneliness that comes after trauma when you have no one to tell who'd understand. She thought about Thomas. What would he have done? If he'd been there. If he'd witnessed what happened. Thomas had never been violent, never raised his voice in anger, never threatened anyone, never solved problems with intimidation or force. But he'd had a way of standing that made other men reconsider their actions. A quiet authority that came from confidence rather than aggression, from knowing his own worth and refusing to diminish someone else's to prove it. He would have stood up, would have said something, would have placed himself between Marilyn and Christopher with the gentle immovability of a wall that didn't need to announce its presence to be effective. But Thomas was gone, and Marilyn had faced it alone, the way she faced everything now. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She froze, teacup trembling in her hand. It was nearly 10 o'clock. No one visited at 10 o'clock unless something was wrong. The knock came again, gentle, almost hesitant. Marilyn set down her tea and moved to the front door, her heart hammering. She looked through the peephole, the fisheye lens that made everything distorted and slightly nightmarish. A figure stood on her porch, male, younger, wearing what looked like a work shirt and dark pants, hands empty at his sides, posture suggesting exhaustion rather than threat. Christopher Francois. Marilyn's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. He was here. The man who'd struck her was standing on her front porch at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night, and every instinct screamed at her to call the police, to not open the door, but she noticed something. His shoulders were slumped, his head was bowed. He held something in his hands, a white envelope, creased and slightly damp from rain, and his face, visible even through the distorted peephole, carried an expression she'd never seen during their restaurant interactions. Shame. Genuine, bone-deep shame that made him look younger and smaller, and completely stripped of the arrogant authority he'd worn earlier like armor. Marilyn's hand moved to the deadbolt, paused, moved again. She opened the door but kept the security chain engaged, creating a 6-inch gap between them. Christopher looked up. Their eyes met. "Mrs. Osborne," he said, his voice cracking on her name. "I know I have no right to be here. I know you could call the police, and I'd deserve whatever happened. But I needed to give you this." He held out the envelope through the gap. Marilyn didn't take it. "It's an apology," Christopher continued. "A real one. Not the kind I give customers when I'm just trying to smooth things over. A real accounting of what I did and how wrong it was, and how—" His voice broke completely. He stood there on her porch, in the rain, holding an envelope with shaking hands, and started to cry. Not theatrical crying, not the performative tears of someone trying to manipulate sympathy. Just the raw, ugly sobbing of someone whose self-image had shattered and who was seeing himself clearly for the first time. "I lost my job," he managed between gasps. "And I deserved to. I lost everything I worked for and I deserved that too. But none of that matters compared to what I did to you. You didn't deserve that. You didn't deserve any of that. You were just existing, just trying to have a nice dinner. And I turned it into something horrible because I was. He couldn't finish. Marilyn watched him cry. Watched him collapse under the weight of consequences he'd never imagined could touch him. Watched him become, briefly, as powerless as he'd made her feel. She could close the door, could call the police, could let him drown in the guilt that was clearly suffocating him. But Marilyn had spent 71 years learning that mercy wasn't weakness, that grace given freely was stronger than revenge taken violently, that the world had enough cruelty without her adding more. She unchained the door. Christopher looked up, terrified. "Come inside," Marilyn said quietly. "You're getting soaked." "I can't. I shouldn't." "Come inside," she repeated, firmer now. "For 5 minutes. Then you'll leave. But I won't have you standing in the rain on my porch while we do this." Christopher hesitated, then stepped across the threshold like a man entering a courtroom for sentencing. Marilyn's living room was modest but comfortable furniture that had been purchased in the 80s and maintained carefully, family photos on every surface. Thomas's reading chair still positioned exactly where he'd left it 9 months ago. Christopher stood just inside the doorway, dripping on the hardwood, still holding the envelope. "Give it to me," Marilyn said, gesturing to the letter. He handed it over like he was relinquishing evidence at a trial. Marilyn opened it. "Read silently." Christopher watched her face, looking for signs of anger or forgiveness, or anything that would tell him how to feel. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten, detailing exactly what he'd done, taking full responsibility, making no excuses, acknowledging her humanity and his failure to see it. The writing was messy, tears had smudged some of the ink, but every word carried weight. Marilyn finished reading, folded the letter carefully, looked at Christopher with eyes that had witnessed decades of human failure and occasional transcendence. "You hit me because you could," she said. "Because I was old and alone and you thought no one would care." "Yes." Christopher's voice was barely audible. "And now you're here because someone made you care. Because there were consequences you didn't expect." "Yes. So is this remorse? Or is this fear?" Christopher looked at her directly for the first time since entering. "Both," he admitted. "I'm terrified of what happens next. But I can't stop seeing your face. The way you looked at me right after. Like you'd expected it. Like you'd been through worse and this was just another thing to endure. I made you feel that way. I did that. And I don't know how to be someone who did that." Marilyn nodded slowly. "Good. Good? That discomfort you're feeling? That shame? That's called a conscience. It's supposed to hurt. It's supposed to make you different." She moved to Thomas's reading chair, sat down carefully. "You can't undo what you did. You can't take back that moment. But you can decide who you are in every moment that follows." Christopher's legs seemed to give out. He sat on the floor, still in the doorway, no longer caring about propriety or dignity. "I'm leaving the city," he said. "Tonight. There's nothing left for me here." "Where will you go?" "I don't know. Somewhere else. Somewhere I can start over." "And what will you do there?" Christopher shook his head. "I don't know that either." Marilyn leaned forward slightly. "Then here's what I want you to do. Whatever job you get, whatever position you find yourself in, remember this night. Remember how powerless feels, and never, ever make someone else feel that way." "I won't. I swear I won't." "Don't swear to me. Swear to yourself. In the mirror. Every morning. Until it becomes so deep in your bones that you can't imagine doing anything else." Christopher nodded, tears streaming freely now. They sat in silence for a long moment, the woman who'd been struck and the man who'd struck her, existing in the complicated space where justice and mercy met and tried to find equilibrium. Finally, Marilyn stood. "You should go now." Christopher rose shakily. "Mrs. Osborne, I know," she said. "Now go, and be better." He left without another word, disappearing into the rain, carrying his shame and his letter and the slim possibility of redemption. Marilyn closed the door, locked it, returned to her chair. The tea was cold now. She picked it up anyway, holding the cup for warmth if not for drinking, and looked at Thomas's photograph on the mantel. "I did okay, didn't I?" she whispered to the image. "I think I did okay." The house settled into silence again. The rain continued. The clock ticked, and Marilyn sat with the knowledge that kindness, real kindness, the kind that cost something, was harder and braver than any violence. Outside, in a black Mercedes 3 blocks away, Jago sat watching the house until Christopher emerged and walked toward the bus station, shoulders bent, carrying one small bag. Dimitri glanced in the rearview mirror. "All finished?" Jago nodded slowly. "All finished." They drove into the rainy night, leaving behind a restaurant manager who'd learned that authority without accountability was just tyranny in a vest, and an elderly widow who'd taught him that mercy was strength in its purest form. Some debts are paid in money, some in blood, and some in the careful, painful work of becoming better than you were. Tonight, all three had been balanced. Thanks for staying with this story right till the final moment. You're the reason these stories come alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to see your thoughts and connect with you down there.